Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this webinar focused on the topic of flaring. My name is Jack McCusker and I'm a climate manager here at IPECA. Today's session will focus on the World Bank's recently published 2024 Global Gas Flaring Tracker Report, and it will feature Zubin Bamji and Alexandrina of the World Bank Global Gas Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. IPECA is a supporting organization of the World Bank's Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative, and it's a pleasure to have them presenting this webinar today. Just before we start, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. So today's session is being held on the On24 platform. So everything you see, including the slides, is resizable and movable. So feel free to move things around and get the most out of your screen. I'll just mention several features. So on the top left of your screen, you'll see the Q&A box, and you may use this to submit questions as we go. And we'll follow up and respond to some of these after the presentation when we get to the Q&A section of this webinar. Moving to the right-hand side of your screen, at the top there's some useful resources that you may like to explore. This includes some websites, related reports, and also the slides from today's presentation. And just below that one is the speaker bios for today's presenters. Also, on the bottom ribbon of your screen, there's a help feature. I think it's indicated by a question mark. But you shouldn't really need to use this. I think most issues can be resolved just by refreshing the page using the F5 key. And this could be useful if you think your slides are falling behind where we are in the presentation. And then just finally, a recording will be available after this session and can be accessed using the same link that you're using now. I'd just like to say a few brief words about IPECA for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization. So IPECA was formed in 1974 following the launch of the United Nations Environment Programme. So this is our 50th birthday this year, and we're a global oil and gas association dedicated to advancing environmental and social performance across the energy transition. We bring together members from industry as well as stakeholders to integrate sustainability by advancing climate action, environmental responsibility, and social performance across the oil, gas, and renewable activities. I guess an interesting point about us is that we're not an advocacy organization. We concentrate mainly on the technical and fact-based information and guidance. And we're also the only global association that covers the full value chain of the industry. In 2022, we launched these principles as a new condition of membership. And these are grouped under our 4 strategic pillars of climate, nature, people, and sustainability. And each thematic area includes 2 principles. So the first provides United Nations, relates to a United Nations convention or initiative. So under the climate pillar, this includes supporting the Paris Agreement. And then the second is designed to advance environmental and social performance of IPECA member companies' operations. And then finally, I'd just like to cover 2 documents that we've released in recent years. So firstly, at the start of 2022, IPECA, in collaboration with IOGP and the World Bank, produced a guidance document on flaring management for the oil and gas industry. So this document outlines developments in flaring management and reduction. It examines sort of industry's experience with eliminating flaring, new technologies, business models, operational improvements, as well as regulatory policy. So there's a QR code there. And there's also, that's downloadable in the resources section on the right-hand side of your screen. And then secondly, earlier this year, IPECA launched our 3rd SDG Roadmap Progress Report. And it is the most comprehensive report we've released so far on this topic. This progress report provides a highlight of sort of how the roadmap's being implemented and how the industry is supporting the achievement of a range of SDGs. It also includes some case studies from member companies, some of which focus on the topic of flaring. So also an interesting one for those in the audience to take a look at. Now, without further delay, I'd like to now pass over to Zubin Bamji, who's a program manager at the World Bank's Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. And they're going to present, as I said, some of the insights from their latest Global Gas Flaring Tracker Report for 2024. So Zubin, passing over to you.
Well, thank you, Jack. Hello, everyone. My name is Zubin Bamji, as Jack mentioned, and I manage the World Bank's Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Program, or GFMR, which is a part of our larger global practice on energy and extractives at the World Bank. So today we wanted to provide IPECA and all of you with an overview of the 2023 global flaring satellite data following the release over the summer of our report, which you can, of course, review on our website. This is our fourth year in a row, I believe, that we're doing this webinar with IPECA, and wanted to just take a quick moment to thank IPECA for this opportunity again, and also thank you all for joining us and for your interest in this topic, which we think is absolutely critical to the oil and gas industry. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alexandrina Platonova-Okon, who leads our technical program and also managed the development of this year's report and analysis. Alexandrina will take us through what the satellite data estimates for 2023 tell us about the state of flaring globally. And she'll also discuss our estimates for the methane emitted through flaring and a metric that we came up with a few years ago called the Imported Flare Gas Index, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at flaring globally. And then, of course, we'll have some time for Q&A. And if we run out of time, which often happens in webinars, we'll also be happy to take a deep dive into specific cases offline and answer any follow-up questions you may have. But first, we wanted to take the opportunity to introduce our new Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership, or GFMR, as we mentioned at the beginning. As you may well already know, decarbonizing and reducing CO2 and methane emissions from oil and gas production is critical to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because our sector accounts for about a fifth of total global anthropogenic methane emissions. And the World Bank is eager to support developing countries accelerate action to reduce these emissions. Now, some of you may recall the World Bank has been engaged in flaring for over 2 decades now, and we had a smaller trust fund focused just on flaring and providing technical support and assistance to developing countries to address it. At last year's COP in Dubai, we announced a new and larger program, GFMR, that garnered very strong support from the UAE, the United States, Norway, Germany, and several oil and gas companies that are members of the IPECA, including BP, Eni, Equinor, Oxy, Shell, and Total Energies. And we know that reducing methane emissions is one of the most important short-term climate actions we can take. However, methane mitigation receives only a fraction of climate finance, and that's the issue for us as well. So building on our previous work at the World Bank on flaring, we established GFMR and are widening our focus to address methane venting and leaks in addition to flaring reduction. So what does this mean more specifically? Well, our support includes primarily catalytic grant funding for leak detection and repair campaigns, because we think this is so important. We'll also be focused on project identification and abatement. We'll be doing pre-feasibility studies, And then we'll also continue to do the capacity building, the institutional strengthening for governments and state-owned entities, and continue with our policy and regulatory advice as we had done before. But again, the key difference between the previous trust fund and the new trust fund is both the size in terms of the amount of financial resources we have, but also our scope, where we'll include the methane leaks and the venting and those types of activities done by the oil and gas industry. And the good news is, even though we just started a couple of months ago, or I should even say a couple of weeks ago, we're already active in several countries such as Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Uzbekistan, and Yemen. And that's just a few that we've either been in dialogue with or engaged in establishing programs on flaring reduction and methane reduction as well. And again, in particular, our support on financing. So what we hope to provide with our new trust funds is catalytic grants for governments and state-owned operators who can, we want to mobilize the finance by covering a portion of project CapEx to make them more attractive to commercial and concessional financiers, including commercial banks, infrastructure investors, project developers, and international finance organizations. And we expect this could be quite a game changer in some cases and in some countries. However, as shown by our continuing commitment to publishing annual flaring data, we don't want to take our eye off the ball when it comes to flaring as well, even though methane, of course, is important. And I just wanted to take a moment to share with you some of the work that we have done previously. On this slide, you see our flaring tracker report that we are going to present today. But then you also see on this slide a report that we did on flaring and venting regulations around the world. There's also an interactive portal on our website where you can look at the policies and regulatory frameworks for several countries around the world, primarily, of course, oil and gas producing countries. And this is a good comparative analysis for many people as well. To the right of that report, you see our flaring data visualization. Every single gas flare on Earth, and there's somewhat 10,000 plus gas flares around the world. And if you zero in on any of these flares, we estimate the emissions from there, the quantification of those gas flares, and other interesting information. On the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, you see some of the technical work our program is involved in, where we looked at some of the small-scale technologies for utilizing associated gas. And then about 3 years ago, we also published a report on the financing solutions to reduce natural gas flaring and methane emissions. And this was kind of a landmark piece for the industry as well as for the World Bank, because it was the first time you had a comprehensive look at the opportunities for financing these projects. Lastly, in our website, in our slide rather here, you see what I mentioned previously, this new metric that we came up with a few years ago on the imported flare gas index. And I'll ask my colleague Alexandrina, who's ready to show you what that exactly is all about in just a moment. But back to our data for 2023, the news, unfortunately, was not great. We saw an increase in flaring, but let me hand off to Alexandrina and ask her to take us through some of the flaring tracker report data and give you some countries that we spotlighted in our report, and then also talk about unlit flaring and methane at the end. Alexandrina, let me hand off to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Zubin. I hope you hear me well.
We hear you just fine, thanks.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, I cannot be seen due to some technical difficulties, but I will be the voice behind the slide. The presentation of the report itself will essentially follow the structure of the report. So we'll first we'll discuss the 2023 evolution of the global flaring indicators. Then we will talk about the main levers of flare volume changes that were observed in several spotlight countries in the report. And then we will recall the concept of imported flare gas index that Zubin mentioned already. And in the last section, I will share with you the main insights that the report this year offered to improve global estimates of methane emissions from unlit flares. So on to the main flare indicators. So here, our first indicator, which is the global flare volume, which you can see here in blue in units of billion cubic meters. This chart is showing actually the evolution of flare volume since the records began in 1996. And these records are based on the satellite observations of flaring. It also shows the global oil production, which is represented here by a black line in units of million barrels of oil per day. We can see that in early 2000s, we observed a decoupling of flaring and oil gas production, but the flare volumes have plateaued in recent years. And last year, the flare volume increased and went back to the level that we've seen last time in 19, so 5 years ago. In 2023, global gas flaring at upstream and oil gas facilities increased by 9 billion cubic meters from 139 BCM in 2020 to 148 BCM in 2023, which represents a 7% increase. And at the same time, the oil production rose by just 1%. We've made estimates of the potential market value of the overall gas flared amount in 23. At the current price of gas, it could have been between $9 billion and $48 billion. And in addition, the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with flare volume is at least 381 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is a very significant number, which is roughly equivalent to putting additional 5 million cars on the road or adding a half of greenhouse gas emissions from the entire aviation industry. Here, this chart shows the top 30 flaring countries that are ranked by 2023 flare volume. And for each country, the flare volumes are indicated for the last 5 years, 2019. On the vertical axis is the flare volume in billion cubic meters. As in the previous years, the global flaring remains dominated by a few countries, with the 9 top emitting countries accounting for 75% of all gas flaring, while they account for less than 50% of the global oil production. And these countries, as you can see here, are Russia, Iran, Iraq, the United States, Venezuela, Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, and Mexico. This chart shows flaring intensity, which is the indicator of the amount of gas flared per barrel of oil produced. And like on the previous slide, we rank here the countries and show the 30 top flaring countries again. And you can see that when we look at flaring intensity, the things change quite dramatically. We can note, for example, low flaring intensity in the United States, which, despite the increase of flaring in 23, is one of the lowest flaring intensity countries. And as in the previous years, we also see that high flaring intensities are observed in fragile conflict-afflicted countries such as Venezuela and Syria. Now, if we look at the average flaring intensity, which is shown here as a dark blue line versus the global flare volumes that are represented by the blue columns, we see that flaring intensity has also essentially plateaued since 2010. Last year, however, it increased by 5%, or by 0.3 cubic meter per barrel of oil produced, bringing the average flaring intensity globally to 5 cubic meters per barrel. In this slide, we look at the countries with the greatest change in flare volumes from 22 to 23, essentially to identify where the most significant changes occurred and who essentially contributed the most to the overall increase of 9 BCM of flaring. 4 countries actually account for this increase, while in other countries the increases and decreases essentially resulted in no further net change. So this major contributor are the 4 countries. So first is Iran, was the largest flaring increase of 3.2 BCM. That represents 19% increase from the last year flare volume in the country. Next is Russia, with an increase of 2.9 BCM, or slightly higher than 10% on the flare volume. Then United States, with an increase of 1.7 BCM, which is about 20% increase from the 22 volume. And lastly, Libya, with an increase of 1.4 BCM, or about 1/4 of the previous year flare volumes. So to understand better what actually happened and what are the levers of this increase, let's focus on these 4 countries first that contributed most to the increase of flaring in 2023. Here in the left-hand side, you can see the chart for Iran, and we see that there is a continued trend over the last 5 years of increasing flaring, which you can see in the blue column, as Iran wraps up its oil production, and the increase in flaring intensity, which is represented in black line, shows that the country is increasingly failing to address flaring. On the right-hand chart, we see the trends for Libya. Here, we see the sharp decrease in flaring in 2020. It was the result of an even sharper drop in oil production due to the internal conflict in the country. This sharp decrease in oil production led to the increase of flaring intensity despite the decrease in flare volumes. Since then, the oil production has recovered and flaring has increased again, and so has the flaring intensity. This suggests that Libya suffers a continuing lack of investment in gas infrastructure. Here in the chart for Russia, we see a steady increase in both flaring, which is again represented in blue column, and flaring intensity shown in the black line over the past few years for Russia as a whole. This increase in flaring occurred across each of the main oil-producing regions, suggesting that the issues were system-wide. And this may be a result of a reduced availability of necessary equipment, in part as a consequence of the supply chain disruptions due to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. In the United States, in the left-hand chart, we see the impressive improvement achieved in the United States for both flaring, again in blue columns, and flaring intensity, the black line. Both essentially halved between 2019 and 22 prior to increasing in 2023. On the right-hand chart, we have plotted the flaring trends for the last 3 years for the Permian, Eagle Ford, and Bakken shale oil basins, and the rest of the United States. As you see, the largest flaring increase took place in the Permian, and we will take a look on the next slide, what were the reasons, as we understand, of the increase in more detail. So here we plotted the monthly flare volume and flaring intensity in Permian Basin in the U.S. So the the Permian Basin, as you probably know, is located in southeast Mexico and Texas. So we see that both flare volumes and flaring intensity increased during the summer months from July to September 2023, which were actually the second hottest on record for Texas. And this prolonged high temperature resulted in significant pressure on the electrical grid, which led to curtailing of power supply that rendered part of the gas takeaway infrastructure inoperable. In addition, for some operators in the region, the gas takeaway capacity was further reduced by an ongoing maintenance and operational issues with part of the midstream network. As a result, some of the operators affected by this reduction in gas takeaway capacity reduced their oil production to avoid excessive flaring, but some who elected to maintain their oil production increased flaring in their production sites. Now on to the example of a good progress, which we have seen in Algeria. Algeria is one of two examples in this year's spotlight in the report, where we see reductions in gas flaring. In the left-hand side, we can see that Algeria has maintained a slow but consistent reduction in its recovery project in Hassim Saoud, which is in particular in Hassim Saoud, which is the largest oil field in Algeria. In this effort has been implemented since 2020 by Sonatrach, which is the national oil company in Algeria. Sonatrach reduced the gas flaring there by over 1 billion cubic meters. So in the right-hand chart, you see this large decrease in flaring in Hassim Saoud is showing in the central blue column. And this reduction, together with the small reduction of less than 0.1 BCM in the rest of Algeria, which is shown in the blue column on the left, led to the overall decrease in Algeria flaring of 1.4 BCM, which you can see in the dark blue column to the very right. And in 2023, Sonatrach committed to similar projects in Tinguentoury, Nohanet, and Tinkoet Tambakot regions, which are anticipated to lead to further reductions in flare volumes in Algeria. We also see progress in Venezuela. In the left-hand figure, the black line indicates a steady reduction in flaring intensity over the 3 last years. And in the right-hand figure, we see that the reduction in flaring of 0.4 BCM and the reduction in flaring intensity took place most exclusively at the oil fields and monogas state in northeast Venezuela. It is shown here by central blue column. In this state, PDVSA, the national oil company of Venezuela, reportedly implemented a number of large-scale projects to manage associated gas. In the rest of Venezuela, flaring increased by 0.1 BCM, which is shown in a short blue column on the left, resulting in a net decrease in the country of 0.3 BCM, again the dark blue column to the very right. So this is on the country spotlight. So I suggest we now move to the imported flare gas index. The imported flare gas index is based on the premise that if a country is importing crude oil, then it is also importing the embedded flaring intensity of these barrels. The imported flare gas index of crude oil importing countries is therefore calculated as the weighted average flaring intensity of oil import based on the country of origin. So you can see here the example where Sweden is shown importing oil from 4 countries: Kazakhstan, Iran, Libya, and Nigeria. Imported flare gas index helps informing oil importing countries on where the flaring hotspots are within the oil supply chain and what are the flaring consequences of the oil that they import. Imported flare gas index can also help in engaging dialogue with the oil and gas suppliers about their flaring performance and potentially leads to assistance implementing flare reduction activities. It can also inform governmental operators in the oil and gas exporting countries about the possible implications of the emerging carbon border adjustment policies and emission transparency initiatives, such as, for example, the recent EU methane regulation and the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, which is expected to start covering oil and gas imports in 2030. This chart shows the imported flare gas index for the top 20 countries, with the highest index among the Annex 1 countries. So you see the stacked chart that indicates how this imported flare gas index values arise. It's a pretty dense slide, and it's a little bit hard to read, but the principle is that the different colors in the stacked bar for each country represent where the crude oil is imported from. So the larger the share of crude oil from a country, the more it will contribute to the importing country's overall imported flare gas index, which is indicated here on y-axis. For example, Greece have a high imported flare gas index because they imported crude from Iraq and Libya, which is shown in brown and chocolate colors. Some Eastern European countries you can see here, such as Bulgaria and Hungary, continue to import the bulk of their oil from Russia, shown in yellow color, again resulting in a high imported flare gas index. On this chart, we show another way of demonstrating how we can read the imported flare gas index comparison. Here it's shown for the top crude oil importing countries, in this case, those that import more than 250,000 barrels per day, against the imported oil volumes. And for comparison, here we see the blue horizontal line that represents the global average flaring intensity in 2023 that we saw previously in the presentation is of 5 cubic meters per barrel. So this type of representation allows to see that there is a number of countries that have an imported flare gas index higher than the average as a result of the mix of crude that they import from high flaring producers. So this, with this slide, we show the data that inform on what is the most important changes in imported flare gas index from 22 to 23. So this concludes the section about the flare index, and I suggest we move to the part of the report that offered some insights on methane emissions from flaring, and specifically from unlit flaring. Flares are a direct source of methane. However, by how much, it is not really well understood currently. The current estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from gas flaring are based on two core assumptions typically. That flares operate at a destruction efficiency of 98%, with only 2% of the methane in the flare gas released uncombusted. And the second assumption is that flares are lit and operating with this efficiency all of the time. However, at any given time in practice, flares may be either lit and operated effectively, or lit and operated ineffectively, which incomplete combustion of methane. It can also be unlit and active, and in which case they will vent methane directly into the atmosphere, or unlit and active with no associated emissions. So we investigated further and will continue to further research to better understand both flare destruction efficiency and the prevalence of unlit flares. The importance of it is shown here. So in this figure, we show how much destruction efficiency can impact methane emissions from flaring. So the columns show the emissions that would result from 148 BCM of gas flared in 23 under different destruction efficiency assumptions. So the dark blue is the amount of CO2 generated from the burn portion of the flared gas, and the light blue is the methane component that is released on combustion. The first column shows the conventional 98 destruction efficiency, which also assumes flares are lit and operating with the destruction efficiency all the time. And you can see how the distribution between CO2 and methane changes, and methane emissions increase as destruction efficiency changes. So taking inefficiently operating flares that may be unlit and venting into account, if the effective destruction efficiency of global flares is only 4% lower, actually 94% rather than 98%, methane emissions from gas flaring will triple. This is why understanding the flare efficiency is really critical to understand methane emissions from flaring. And this year, we shared a novel approach that GFMO has developed that could be used to determine the prevalence of unlit flares globally, which is one of the important pieces of the puzzle to understand methane emissions from flaring. Here we explain what essentially this approach consists of, based on a case study which is focused on a site in Central Asia. The chart on the left shows the nightly flaring detections from various instruments on board 2 satellites operated by NOAA in orange, overlaid with the flaring detection from Sentinel-2, which is operated by the European Space Agency. This both confirm a flare detected at this facility almost continuously from June 16 until February 21, where the detections abruptly stopped. And in the image on the lower right-hand side, you can see a visible flare at this facility. In order to investigate if the flare has become inactive, or simply stopped, or has become unlit, and therefore venting methane instead, we have pulled together methane detection from several different sources: Kairos, a commercial satellite data provider; Carbon Mapper, which is a publicly available database of detections by the INIT instruments on board of the International Space Station, and from the UNEP's publicly available INEO Mars platform. This data support multiple detections of methane at this facility in the vicinity of the flare stack, indicated by the dots in the image on the very right hand side. And there is always some uncertainty in the position of the methane detections, but this picture clearly shows the cluster around the flare site. These detections have been added to the time series of flaring detection, and it clearly supports that this flare has become unlit and is venting methane. So from our perspective, this is a convincing example of how, by looking for intermittency, in this case, succession of detections in various flare detections, potential unlit flare situations can be identified, and satellite data can be searched for the presence of methane detection at the location. So we will continue to perfect the method and giving the importance of the contribution of potentially unlit flares to the methane emissions. So to finish the presentation, I just wanted to highlight a few recommendations that came out of the 2024 report, where we highlight the urgent need to mobilize and renew political will and leadership, coupled with industry investments and improved practices across the world to take critical actions that must be taken really on several fronts. First of all, it's important to accelerate flaring reduction progress in the top 9 flaring countries that remain so for, as we've seen, for many years. And for this, it's really critical to kickstart investment plans to accelerate the flaring reduction. It's important that to ensure that the investment in associated gas recovery and utilization projects are prioritized. when operators and governments are planning, designing, and operating oil and gas infrastructure. It's also critical, as we've seen, for where the flares still continue to minimize the methane emissions by ensuring that the flares are lit and operating effectively. We also see emerging evidence of the importance to design oil and gas infrastructure and emission reductions projects in a way to better withstand the physical impact of climate change hazards, and to ensure that oil and gas operators have access to the financial and technical support needed to reduce gas flaring. Finally, it is critical to continue promoting the best practices of managing oil and associated gas production within the handling capacity of existing gas infrastructure where it exists. And underlining all this critical efforts is the importance to leverage existing collaboration between public and private sectors to enable the widespread adoption and implementation of effective regulations that is actually a critical enabling factor for all these actions that I mentioned. Thank you so much, and this concludes the presentation. Over to Jack or Adam.
Yeah, thank you to Zubin for that introduction, and also Alexandrina for those new insights from this year's report. Yeah, I think as we run these webinars every year now, it's interesting to see what's changed and what the differences are in your analysis and the trends that you're seeing. So, yeah, huge thanks for giving that presentation. I see there's been a number of questions submitted. So I'd now like to pass over to Adam Paxi as a methane policy advisor at Chevron and also chair of IPECA's methane task force. But just a quick reminder that you can still submit questions using the Q&A box on the top left-hand side of your screen. So Adam, passing over to you.
Thanks, Jack. First off, I'd like to echo the thanks for the World Bank team in presenting. It's certainly interesting every year to see the changes at sort of the national level and understand trends. So very well done report. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question as we're waiting for a few more to get in, and then I'll move on to ones that have been turned over or that have been submitted by folks. The first one is data uncertainty has become a pretty big topic in a number of different forums. What kind of ranges is the data that you have in terms of individual flares or in terms of the aggregation at the country level? How big do you think the uncertainty bars are on the analysis that's being provided, or is there a way to understand that?
Thanks, Adam. Unfortunately, somehow my camera doesn't seem to be working as it did at the beginning. Is it working for everyone?
I am only seeing a black screen.
Yeah, very strange. My apologies for that. Let me go ahead and answer your question. So, yeah, the data uncertainty, there's always a certain amount of uncertainty there, right? And only all of this can be verified by doing metering with high quality metering equipment and that sort of thing. That being said, we have a significant degree of confidence in the data, and we've worked really hard at this for a long time and several years in partnership with the Colorado School of Mines and others to ensure that these estimates are as accurate as can be. You may recall that previously gas flares were detected using the light produced, but now in recent years, it's far more accurate because we're using the radiated heat from these gas flares to determine and quantify the volumes of gas being emitted. Now, have we had some questions from governments and operators about our data and the accuracy of it? Yes, but I have to say it's not been that much at all. I would just say in the last decade or so, we've only been questioned by maybe 2 or 3 operators or governments. And when we do see or do hear from a government or operator that questions the accuracy of our data, we're happy to engage with them because we want to make sure we get it right as well. So we spend a lot of time engaging in a reconciliation process with the operator or the government to ensure that we do have it right. And at least in my time, which is several years now, we haven't really had to change much of our data. We have had to change things like the operator of the gas flare, the party responsible, maybe a few things here and there, but it hasn't been significant in any manner whatsoever. And let me also take the opportunity then to just mention that, if anybody does have a question about it, we do welcome that, again, because of the need to get this right. The World Bank, as many of you know, is an independent multilateral organization. We don't have any vested interests in this topic, which makes us a suitable partner for many organizations and governments and operators to do the right thing. So that's really what we're there for. Let me see if my colleague Alexandrina may want to add anything to there.
Yes, thank you, Zubin. I just wanted to add that we continuously work on improving the quality of interpretation of satellite-based gas flaring data. And we are now continue to essentially bring more of the data from satellites with much higher resolution that VIIRS that we traditionally use, and we essentially enhance it with analysis, as I mentioned, on Landsat, Sentinel series of satellites. And we're doing it in collaboration with Oil and Gas Climate Initiatives that are also supporting the Earth Observation Group and Colorado School of Mines efforts to collect and interpret this data. So we hope that with each next edition of the report, the methodology will continue to improve and evolve, reducing the uncertainty. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexandrina. And let me just quickly add also, if you go to our data visualization on the website, you'll see our methodology presented, how this is done. And if you have any questions about that, please do reach out to us. Happy to answer them for you.
Yeah, appreciate the answer to that. I'm going to start off with a question from the audience that's talking about sort of regional partnerships. I think this is in relationship to the GFMR that was started up last year. Has there been any work to sort of get together with regional partnerships like the Methane Emissions Observatory of Latin America that's working with local governments, the Global Methane Hub, and other stakeholders to try to fund methane reduction projects in Latin America? Is there do you see sort of the role of GFMR as sort of working through some of those organizations at more of a regional level, sort of doing your own projects in those kind of regions? What's kind of the relationship you have with some of the other initiatives that are out there?
So that's actually a great question, because when we were setting up this new partnership and the trust fund and program, there was a lot of discussion about finding where the gaps were in support to industry organizations and operators. And so we spent considerable time ensuring that the World Bank had the proper role, and we were not duplicating efforts with any organization, private sector or public sector. And so, again, what we have done is spent a lot of time with OGCI, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which was started in Dubai by the UAE and several others. Of course, we work with the UN Environment Program and the IMEO, and are involved and engaged with EDF and several other industry organizations. And what we realized as we sort of deliberated on our role is the financing, again, was a key gap in flaring and methane reduction. And that's a suitable role for the World Bank, as many of you know, that is our bread and butter program. Providing financing to developing countries. So we sort of identified that early in the process as something that we could take on. And again, we don't have the financing, at least not in our trust fund, to actually do the projects, flaring and methane reduction projects around the world. But what we do have is enough money and grant support to provide catalytic grants, as I mentioned early, that incentivize the operators and then give other financiers the comfort to come in and support the rest of the project financially. So again, this is kind of our role. I was not aware of the Latin American initiative that's mentioned here in the Q&A, as well as what you mentioned, Adam. So I do encourage whoever sent that question to please get in touch with us, because we would like to learn more about what you all are doing. And this is not something that we had heard about. So please do.
Thanks. Certainly encourage. And I think if you don't have Zubin's contact information, I'm sure Jax would be willing to get you all in touch, but certainly important to make connections on calls like this. I'm going to combine a couple of different questions that are coming in about Europe and policy there. And to the extent you're able to talk about it, there's kind of a question on how this data could be used either in sort of a carbon border adjustment or CBAM mechanism, or how this might relate to the import provisions of the EU methane rule and requirements to provide flaring and venting information from imported crude and natural gas. Is there any, could you speak to how this information is either used or not being used in policy in Europe, connectivity to Europe, of the analysis that you're doing, or whatever you're able to answer on that would, I think, be helpful.
Sure. And Alexandrina, please feel free to come in after me if you have any additional thoughts or comments. Yeah, we have engaged with the European Commission for many years now and consider them a really good partner in our trust fund because this is of a priority to them. And I will say, after we introduced our imported flare gas index metric, again, it's been about 3-4 years when we came up with it and socialized it globally and received feedback and input on it. The European Commission was very interested and actually told us that some of the policies that they were establishing were very much related and were somewhat inspired by what we had done with the imported flare gas index. So that was encouraging to us because they found it to be quite powerful. And then they recognized the role that importing countries, including many in the European Union, can play in reducing methane and flaring from the oil and gas industry. So they see that they now have a responsibility to also put in the incentives for operators to reduce their flaring and methane emissions and end routine flaring, if I may. So this was kind of a catalytic role we played in terms of regulation and policy, and we were happy to do that. I hope that answers your question, but maybe Alexandrina has some additional thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Zubin. It's a great question. So just to add, is that in our plans for the next years is to continue working on how we could help inform the compliance or understand impacts. Essentially, we, for example, were working closely with OGMP 2.0 initiative, where, as you may know, for the high level of reporting requirements, there is, for instance, a requirement to measure, for instance, the efficiency of flaring or methane destruction. So we are planning to invest in better understanding what would be the best methodology, recognizing that in the client countries of ours, so in developing countries, the national oil companies may not have equal access always to the same technologies that may be recommended for Annex 1 countries. And therefore, we are trying to adopt the guidance and clarify how the requirements can be met. So we progressively improve the data available and how the reconciliation may happen between the data that is obviously based on satellite-based observations that we are reporting through the imported flare gas index and the measurements on the ground, and potentially and continue obviously to collaborate and see how it can be instrumental to inform CBAM implementation or EU methane regulation. So this is very much on our radar screen, and we will continue working on this. Thank you.
Thanks. There's a question for a little bit deeper dive on one of the countries that you highlighted this year as seeing significant reductions in terms of Venezuela. Could you maybe comment on the extent to which that's the changes are related to the actual implementation of projects or infrastructure versus related to declines in sort of oil and gas production in the country, sort of writ large, and what kind of the balance between the two is based on the information you have?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask Alexandrina to answer that more thoroughly than perhaps I will, with just a quick comment at the outset, which is, yeah, this is mostly related, as we understand, to the decline in the industry and in general with the infrastructure and the ability and capacity of the government to address things in terms of production, as well as with flaring and methane emissions. Alexandrina, do you want to elaborate a little bit on that to the extent we have knowledge? Of course, it's not easy for us to know the details of what might be going on in Venezuela and many other countries, but we do have an overall sense, or try to get an overall sense when we do our annual report. Alexandrina?
Sure. As I mentioned, that we essentially observed the reduction in flaring and intensity almost exclusively in Monagas State at all fields. We do not necessarily have a chance to reach out and have much more detailed information about the nature of projects, but we also collected evidence from other partners, like in EU efforts to directly support the projects that manage associated gas. But this is the extent of the detail that we have, which I think also reflected in the report.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you guys are very busy, and I think there's time for one more question for the session. And again, really appreciate your time and willingness to answer the extensive questions around that folks have put in. I think if there's additional ones, again, feel free to reach out to Jack to send in additional questions if they come up later, and we can get them over to the World Bank team. I'll go with one final one, that there's a couple of questions in here about sort of mechanisms to either incentivize or help install infrastructure to help increase takeaway capacity, be those things like government subsidies to do that, or there's a few other ideas in different questions in the chats. Can you guys maybe make just a quick comment on the role of infrastructure in sort of furthering flaring reduction projects?
Yeah, sure. Another good question. Absolutely. This is one of the key foundational elements of flaring and methane reduction, right? You have to develop the policies and regulatory frameworks that incentivize operators in your country or jurisdiction and make it far more economical to address flaring and methane reduction. So this is a key aspect of our advice to many governments and operators and around the world and in developing countries. What we find is, in many cases, emerging economies, as we call them, or developing countries, just don't have the capacity and resources to address even instituting the regulations and policies that enable flaring and methane reduction. So we spend time supporting that effort, and this is absolutely crucial. That governments put in those policies that do enable these projects to happen far more quickly, and also provide the economic benefits from it. Just overall, quickly, I thought I'd make that a quick comment since we're running out of time here. But again, happy to enter into a discussion more deeply if the person asking the question would like.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose just looking at the time, it's probably best if we close the Q&A there. And I think just to conclude the session, Just wanted to say thank you once again to Zubin and Alexandrina for the presentation today, and also for answering so many questions. I know it could be difficult getting put on the spot, but thank you both. Thanks to Adam for taking the time to moderate today's discussion. And then finally, just to thank you to everyone on the line for your participation today. As mentioned, a recording will be available for this one, and that will be, you can access that using the same link that you're using now. But other than that, I'd just like to say thank you and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having us. It was an interesting session. Great question.
Thank you. Thanks very much.